Trulioo's Hal Lonas wanted to be an astronaut, but rocket science moved just a little too slow for his tastes. I'm Joel McConvey, and today on the Biometric Update podcast, I chat with Trulioo's Chief Technology Officer about the path from space travel to the outer reaches of fraud prevention. So today we have Hal Lonas from Trulioo joining us. Hal, thank you for your time today. Appreciate you coming. And I understand you're going to tell us how wanting to be an astronaut led you to a career in fraud prevention. Is that right?
That's right. Hey, Joel, thanks for having me on Biometric Update. I really appreciate it, and I love what you guys do. Maybe a bit of an interesting journey. When I was a kid and younger, I wanted to be an astronaut. I was a big fan of NASA and all that. And I actually went to school for that. I have a degree in aeronautics and astronautics and kind of did that really early in my career. And what I found was that I was a little bit impatient. And so I found that I didn't want to work on something that might not ever see the light of day or might take years to get out there. And so I actually gravitated towards more like software and computer sciencey things and things that would get out there sooner. And I found my way into cybersecurity about 25 years ago, and I have really enjoyed the field. And I think identity verification and the things we do with biometrics are very, very close to cybersecurity with kind of good guys and bad guys and a lot of technology going on all the time. So that's a little bit about me and kind of how I found my way here. But actually still tend to think of things through sort of maybe that aerospace or aero astro lens, even in my engineering throughout my career.
I know you've sort of got this mantra in aeronautics: nothing can fail, because if you put someone in space, clearly if something fails, that's a big problem. Does that to you apply in the same way to sort of the identity space?
Yeah, very much so. I really enjoy building systems and thinking about things in that kind of, we can't fail sort of attitude. And so I like to think about like applying automation or even when humans are in the loop in systems, like really looking at things through a systems point of view that won't have failures, and it won't break down or fail in the face of adversity, whether the adversity is like high customer loads or kind of attacks we haven't seen before, whether it's one or many. But yeah, I like to kind of think in things in terms of that sort of can't fail attitude. Yep.
Pace is a really interesting thing in this industry, because you mentioned things were moving too slow for you at NASA, and in this industry, things move faster than almost anything else. Like it's crazy to see things change day to day. And I wonder, is that a challenge from the regulatory, from the standardization perspective? How do you sort of reconcile the sort of speed at which this stuff moves with the need, that you would be familiar with from aeronautics to kind of have an established baseline of trust?
Yeah, that it's something we think about all the time. And you're actually bringing up a really interesting point, which is there's so many moving parts here, right? There's like, I've mentioned before, like there's these bad actors that are trying to break in systems and trying to figure out where they can exploit and do things. And we're working within this framework of trying to keep those people out. However, let good customers in and keep those good customers all the time. And that's kind of one motion we do. But another big motion that you're pointing out is the regulatory framework and the compliance network we live within, which has a number of very interesting kind of facets to it. One is it says what companies have to do to remain compliant. And I mean, honestly, sometimes that helps a company like Trulioo. Sometimes it's hard for us to keep up, but we want to look ahead and see what's coming. And we have our finger on the pulse of things around the world, being a global company and really looking at regulatory across not only North America but Europe as well, South America, the APAC. So we really look at global markets and global regulatory and try to keep up. And then we also try to anticipate, like, what are the bad guys going to do in the face of that too? So we try to put ourselves in the shoes of all these different players and say, if Europe does one thing, will North America respond the same? both from a compliance and regulatory, but also what people are doing. Are people adapting new ways of doing finance and new ways of running transactions, and then what are the sort of the exploits that might be exercised against them? So it's a super interesting, and it moves very fast, as you said, which I find both challenging but also very exciting and engaging.
Something else that's moving very fast that you mentioned is fraud. It seems some days that we've released all this generative AI into the world, and primarily it's being used to sort of supercharge fraud. Can you give me a sort of your take on the current state of the fraud landscape? Where are we with deep fakes and synthetic identity and all of this?
Yeah, it's a cat and mouse game, right? I mean, we see new things all the time. Being where we sit at Trulioo, I'm sure you do as well, and we see the bad guys really taking advantage of the technology. They're early adopters, and they take advantage of things like the advances in chips and GPUs and AI, and they've created this pretty impressive sort of toolbox of like, how do I create a synthetic identity or a deep fake that's indistinguishable from a human being? And also, they kind of do less exciting things as well, like figure out like how do I fuzz up my data to make it sort of passable. Whether I'm kind of exploring social security numbers in the United States or addresses in somewhere like France or Japan that maybe don't have quite the same address system as other areas. So it's very interesting to look at like how the bad actors also take advantage of the stuff that's headlines, like fake fight scenes between famous actors, but also just like more mundane things like fuzzing up data to try to get through systems, or using deceased people or out of businesses, or whatever they're doing is very interesting and actually very innovative, and often takes advantage of this technology that's been released. And got to say, like it's a challenge for us, to keep up with that, and again, like anticipate where we think that's going to go, and the good news is we see a lot of transactions. So we see millions of transactions, and we're able to, like I said, kind of keep our finger on the pulse of what's going on. And I think between a team of human researchers and what we see with the automation, we try to stay ahead of it.
What are you seeing as sort of the bleeding edge, so to speak, of fraud techniques and attacks right now?
It's very interesting, and we do see all kinds of very we work in an office, and I'm right down the hall from analysts and engineers, and sometimes there's a bit of a buzz, and I'll walk down the hall and an analyst sees something that they haven't seen before, or they say like, wow, this like could have gotten through, and like we caught it, let's make sure we shore up this area. Or it's just very interesting to hear like what's going on when your frontline people are seeing all this really innovation from the bad guys.
And is this primarily, if it's identity fraud, is it what are the targets? Is it targeting document verification? Is it targeting onboarding? What and where is happening?
Really all fronts, but like those are two really interesting ones. Like, so onboarding, typically it can be a low friction movement, like a data verification, but it can also be like a document verification with you guys are super familiar, government issued IDs, and then matching that with a selfie, and many aspects of that, right? Like you're looking at the document for authenticity and things like watermarks and holograms and backgrounds, and has it been tampered? And there's a lot we can do with that. We can see an awful lot of things, and really interesting things like mathematics, like Fourier transforms and things that are looking at signals in the data, that like, is that a normal pattern we're seeing from I don't know, like a UK identity card, or is that something different, or something that we haven't seen before? And then, of course, the biometric part, or the kind of the live biometric part of like, is this a live person who's actually showing me their document right now, or taking pictures, or even video streams of it as our technology does, and then matching that up and saying it's a live person. It's not a picture off of Facebook. It's not a screen grab of something else. It's a live person with this document this day. And there's just so much we can do with that, with the cameras and the techniques and the mobile devices we have today. There's a lot of data that we can process. And of course, the challenge for us is processing it very quickly, so the person who's being identified doesn't kind of lose interest or say like, man, this is too much trouble, I'm just going to pass, and try someone else's onboarding procedure or transaction. And then you bring up another really good point, which is just document authenticity across the line, because a lot of times, like, we try to verify businesses by saying like, hey, could you upload a utility bill or something that shows your address or something that kind of verifies your business, and those things can actually be more easily tampered with than a government issued ID. They're not made to be tamper proof quite as well. So we have to apply, again, very sophisticated techniques to look at those documents. So it's a lot of work, and we're doing things like now, like trying to move beyond templates where we say, hey, I know what let's pick on myself, a California driver's license should look like. But of course, there's like 15 versions of California IDs for like not non-drivers and for minors and for all kinds of stuff, commercial. So getting beyond that into like, what does a kind of a generic document look like if it's been tampered with? Like, what's tampering really mean? If I have to apply it to a utility bill that doesn't have all those security features on it and a picture of the utility owner or the business owner. So it's just a very, very interesting area to try to apply technology to and sort of stay ahead of the bad guys.
And where, in your estimation, do sort of digital credentials, things like mobile driver's licenses, fit into this picture as a sort of fraud prevention engine, but also just as sort of the future of identity?
Yeah, I think that's an area where we'll continue to see improvement, where like, wallets with driver's licenses in them can be used. I think there's still some, possible holes in that. And I think the bad guys are going to figure out how to exploit some of those things. But certainly it does, I think, start to shore up a lot of areas. And I think what we see at Trulioo is, our business is global. So our customers appreciate that, even in the patchwork quilt that is, the United States with driver's licenses, which is crazy when you think about it, right? States will adopt that technology at different speeds and at different kind of rates and do different things with it. And we have to keep up and kind of identify everybody. And that's just the United States. Think about like what goes on in South America with national IDs or the Far East and like those systems. And we're actually tracking all of that. So we kind of laugh about it a bit at Trulioo, but we say like, look, the more complicated the world gets with sort of different rates of adoption of the technology, actually the better we do in a way, because we're tracking all of that. So it might get better in one small area, and it might get better in different areas over time, but we're actually tracking from the most sophisticated ways of identifying people to the least sophisticated ways of identifying people, and covering that whole spectrum of what's possible, because that's what our customers want. They say like, hey, I don't want to deal with the complexity of this, so you guys do it. So that's where we're bringing value to the table, and we're really covering the whole range there.
It really does seem like that's where everything is moving towards, away from this notion that I'm identifying someone by a feature, a picture, what have you, and really more about a sort of ecosystem of behaviors and transactions and a network of information and data that sort of defines a person, or an identity.
Absolutely. Absolutely right. And, I'll tell you, Joel, like one of the things that scares me a little bit, and I probably think too much about this, is like, if you have a system where you're logging in and you use a password, that's, we all know the security features of that there's a lot of problems with passwords, right? We all know about it. And biometrics give us such slicker ways to do things. I know, like I use my thumbprint on my phone all the time, and it works so great. It works. But one of the little things that bothers me in the back of my head is if my biometrics are ever compromised in some way, like somebody gets a hold of them, well, I'm kind of stuck, right? Because I can change my password, I can make it longer and more secure. I can go for two-factor if I need to, different ways. But if my biometrics get compromised and someone could actually like use my biometrics, I'd kind of be stuck. So I don't know. I even worry about the high tech stuff and like where that eventually goes, and like making sure that really is secure, in the case of biometrics.
But I want to ask, what is Trulioo's sort of lodestar? Where's the company heading? Where will you be a year from now? What's that path that it's following as its sort of strategic guide?
It's really interesting, and like we look at where we've been strong, in the past, and we think about like where should we go from here, and part of our kind of I think thinking is that we probably need to redefine what we do and think more about if you think big picture, what are we really doing? We're preventing financial crime is really what we're doing, and so we think about like it's like financial trust and identity trust, but it's also about really preventing the bad guys from getting in systems, whether it's initially at like onboarding time or more even like the Trojan horse, where you know very well that the bad actors get in, they sit quiet for days, weeks, months, and then they pop up and do things that companies, their hosts, were not expecting. So we think about like more of the life cycle of financial crime. Like, what can you know even before onboarding with devices and device information? What do you know at the onboarding step itself about people and who they are, who they say they are, and then what happens after that as they start exercising transactions? But really, what's the whole life cycle of that relationship? And then, like, kind of broadening the use case to say, well, it's really not just about like a few tiny bits of information about onboarding, but what is like really the person or the business's like credit stature, and what's their sort of risk of dealing with them. And I say risk in a very broad sense, like what's the financial risk, what's the reputational risk, what's the sort of even broadening to like is this someone you want to do business with from a sort of a reputational, like I want to be associated with them kind of risk. So we think about things very broadly and where things are going, and we look at how our customers are using us today, and it's actually kind of broad. It's pretty broad, and so we're thinking about how we embrace more of that and really just make products that address a sort of a broader capability.
Yeah, and with the pace of change, do you find that shifting, or are you able as a company and as a business to sort of say, no, this is the path we're on? How often do you have to sort of like shimmy?
Yeah, well, it goes back to what I think what we talked about before. I think there's a number of different areas where we want to focus. We think about regulatory and compliance. Coming back to that, like what's going on with the regulatory and compliance sort of landscape that creates opportunities both for us and for our customers. Like where should we go to help? And then we think about it from the standpoint of the bad guys. Where are they exploiting the technology and tools, and what's that all about? But then I think you bring up a really good point, which is like the focus aspect. So like, do we want to focus on certain verticals, certain industries, certain things where we know we're really good? But I think more and more we find utility in a lot of other kind of associated areas, and so sort of picking and choosing the right adjacencies to move into, both from a market and from a technology perspective, where to go next and how to make that be, just relevant and useful to more customers is kind of what we're all about. We've been very, very successful with some very large customers, and I think used it in very large volumes. And so thinking about like, well, those were big wins. Like, so there's a lot of utility. So how do we kind of build on that success and recreate the successes there with products and technology?
Excellent. Before we sort of finish up, I've heard you in other interviews refer to yourself as a nerd, and the astronaut dream suggests to me, a fascination with space. I wonder if there's like a sci-fi movie or story that inspired you, either to on the astronaut and aeronautics side, or to get into fraud prevention and the identity sector.
Well, I'm actually inspired by a lot of things. I'm inspired by like SpaceX. Starlink is approaching their 10,000th satellite. That's pretty amazing. You think about that, and like nobody could have ever imagined that. But if I go back in time, actually, one thing that really inspired me as a young person was Apollo 13, and I think that's both a real story, and there's movies and documentaries about it. But I think like that kind of slogan that, the famous thing, failure is not an option, goes back to what we talked about before with how you build systems and how you think about building trust and making sure that identities are secure and used. And think about like the problems that Apollo 13 faced with kind of an explosion on the way to the moon, and then using parts of the spaceship like a lifeboat to get back, and just the various challenges they worked through along the way. But they overcame a lot of adversity and figured out how to get people back safely. And I think the same thing. Like we face a lot of adversity, and sometimes things pop up in our company and in our industry that are like, wow, this is a big challenge. And I personally love to rise to a challenge and figure out how to solve problems. Is really what engineering is all about. And so really appreciate that. And I find things like that super inspiring.
Houston, we have a solution. That's got to be the mantra.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Thanks to Hal Lonas from Trulioo for giving us a little tour of the cosmos today. You can learn more about the company's fraud prevention tools at trulioo.com. And for all the latest news in biometrics and digital identity, be sure to visit www.biometricupdate.com.